Thank you. Thank you, Kara, and thank you for having me at Book Passage again. So tonight I'm going to tell you a story about Dorothy Kilgallen, a side of her that nobody knew about, including me. Before I do that, you know, it's 7 o'clock at night. I don't want anybody falling asleep on me. So we're going to play a video that Jay, the wonderful creator of the websites, my website, Mark Shaw Books, the reporter who knew too much.com website, and a brand new site called the Dorothy Kilgallen story.org, where some of the videos, or I'm sorry, all of the videos that I'm going to tell you about tonight that have made such a difference in my research are now posted. And Jay did that. And so, you know, we're going to do that, but we're going to do that at the end of the program with the book trailer. But right now, we want to play just a quick video that Jay created. We'll see if this wakes you up, all right? Go ahead. It kind of elevates Dorothy's death, as you can see, with some of the central figures really in history. Marilyn Monroe, both Kennedys, Jack Ruby, Lee Harvey Oswald, all of that. And that's been one of the uphill battles with this, because most people remember Dorothy Kilgallen from what? What's My Line? Game show. Tough on there, like a prosecutor and all of that. But many people, including me, and we'll get to that in a minute, had no idea about another part of her life. And what I'm going to try to do tonight is I'm going to try to kind of have you go on the journey that I did, that I experienced with writing this book from start to finish. So we'll start with this. This is the third time I've appeared at Book Passage, and the first time was with this book, Melvin Belli, King of the Courtroom. Melvin Belli was a legendary San Francisco lawyer. Many of you may know that. I happened to know Mr. Belli in the mid-'80s when I practiced law a bit, and I had an office in his building. He and I became friends, quite a character, as you remember, the gold Rolls Royce and all that. He actually took me to the Major League Baseball All-Star game in that Rolls Royce. And at the game, he was treated like a rock star, people coming up for autographs and all of that. Well, I knew him, and when he died in 1996, I decided to write a biography. There had never been one. He'd written a couple autobiographies, and if you put them side by side, they're completely two different stories, all right? But that's who he was, you know? There are all the conflicts in there. Anyway, I wrote this book, and when I was doing it, I learned a lot about him, and one of the things I learned was his affection for the mafia. There's a quote in that book that says, Mel loved the mafia, and the mafia loved him, and he did. He represented the Rolling Stones, Muhammad Ali, all of those people, but one of his main clients was Mickey Cohen. And if you're old enough to remember, he was a Los Angeles gangster, a murderer. And while I was researching, I found out about that affiliation, and it started to make me question his representation of his most famous client, Jack Ruby, who killed Lee Harvey Oswald. Okay? Well, I got to wondering about the whole mafia connection and everything else, and so that kind of was touched on in this particular book as it having to do with the JFK assassination, but I left it there. And I started to look more back toward the Kennedy family. And that resulted in the second book when I was here, The Poison Patriarch, how the betrayals of Joseph P. Kennedy caused the assassination of JFK. And just quickly, the theory in that book was this. You go back to Joe Kennedy and the 1960 election, and you may remember that the Kennedys felt like they were going to lose that election unless they carried Illinois and West Virginia. And Joe, because of his friendship with the mafia through Frank Sinatra and all of that, encouraged the mafia to help him win both of those states, with the promise that if they won, the new administration would leave them alone. Well, they won the election, and Joe immediately double-crossed him. I had an eyewitness. You know, my books, I pride myself on primary sources, not speculation. And that's especially true with Dorothy's book. And in that particular situation, I had an eyewitness who was right there the night that Joe Kennedy basically ordered JFK to appoint Bobby Kennedy Attorney General. And what did Bobby do? He went after those guys. One in particular, Carlos Marcello, a New Orleans Don that you'll hear about in Dorothy's book as well. Deported him, came back to the United States, he tried to deport him again. And when JFK was killed, he was actually in a trial for racketeering in New Orleans at the time. So my conclusion in that particular book was this. They just couldn't let Bobby Kennedy keep coming after them. If you kill Bobby Kennedy, John Kennedy comes after you with everything the government has. But if you kill Jack Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy is powerless. And that is exactly what happened. Okay, they never bothered those guys again. So, that was it. I was done with those two books. I thought that's my contribution. But during the Belli book, I talked to a guy down in San Diego, a doctor who was a good friend of Melvin Belli's. And during the conversation, he said, well, you know, Mel knew Dorothy Kilgallen. And I said, what? From What's My Line? He said, no, Mark. You've missed it like all the other authors through the years have missed it. She had another side to her life. She was a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and a crack investigative reporter. All right? And when she died, Mel said to me, they've killed Dorothy. Now they'll go after Ruby. I could never get that quote out of my mind. I finally decided I'm going to find out about this. I'm going to find out about who is they that killed Dorothy Kilgallen, because the official report, as you'll learn, was an accidental death, and that was the end of it. So what did I do? I started in, and I looked at Dorothy. Well, the first thing that we see is, what's my line? Bennett Cerf, Arlene Francis, Dorothy Kilgallen as the three main panelists. John Daly was the host, right? Watched every Sunday night for 15 years by 20 million people. Okay? And she had a hard-edged attitude on that show. And as we go through, I want you to kind of think about the listing of the enemies of Dorothy Kilgallen as we go along, okay? One of them with that hard-edged part of her had to do with her column called Voice of Broadway. New York Journal-American, every day syndicated to 200 newspapers across the country. Now you have to remember, this is at a time when television was at its infancy. There were the 3 networks. We might have been better off then. 3 networks, okay? But where did people get their news? They got it from the printed newspaper. Not only that, she had a radio show in New York City, Breakfast with Dorothy and Dick, watched by 1 million people every morning. And she was a crack investigative reporter who covered many of the major crimes of the 20th century. This is her at the Dr. Sam Shepard case in, 1954. Now, if you don't know, that is the case of the doctor who supposedly killed his pregnant wife. Became the foundation for the television series, The Fugitive, and the movie starring Harrison Ford. She also covered the Lindbergh baby kidnapping case, the Lenny Bruce First Amendment case. The New York Post called her the most powerful female voice in America. Ernest Hemingway said she's the greatest female writer in the world. Those aren't bad endorsements. Okay, so what else about her? Well, she did all that while raising 3 kids. She broke the glass ceiling before anybody even knew what that term meant. There's nobody can touch her today. You see in the subtitle of the book, media icon. I don't care if it's Barbara Walters or Oprah or anybody. Nobody could touch her. She was the most powerful voice. She made millions in today's dollars, and she had power. She had the bully pulpit. She was somebody that was trusted every day to read about, to read her words. She was at the top of her profession. Multifaceted. I have such respect for her through the research that I've done. So then what happened? Well, JFK got killed. And she launched what will turn out to be the biggest investigation of her life. Why did she get interested in JFK's assassination? Well, it wasn't business as usual. The reason it wasn't business as usual is this guy right here, Kerry, her youngest son. Kilgallen knew JFK as a senator. He came over to her house to play charades, for heaven's sakes. She met with him at the Stork Club and other nightclubs in New York City. But she took Kerry to the White House, and Pierre Salinger arranged a tour, and JFK came into the library and was so kind to Kerry. He looked at letters that Kerry had brought from his third grade class. He gave him a PT 109 pin for his lapel. Just treated him like family. All right? So when JFK died, Dorothy wrote about that, and she told about what happened. And here are the words that she used to describe JFK's death. The picture that stays in my mind is the one of this tall young man bending over a small boy, carefully scrutinizing envelopes until he came to the name Kerry Ardent Calmer, grade 3B. This is the man who was assassinated in Dallas. So having learned all that, I intensified my investigation of Dorothy. And I first looked at a book by Lee Israel that was written in the 1970s about Kilgallen. A lot of background information in there, all of that. It touched on things about her death and everything, but I really felt like that it was incomplete with what this particular author was able to find. Then I researched her articles and her columns from the days when she was with the Journal American. And now I want to show you some of them. Remember now, she launched this investigation into the Oswald and JFK assassinations with all of the vigor that she used in every investigation that she had, but now it was personal. And so, right from the beginning, with all the sources she had in Dallas, inside the police department there, everything else, she decided what, in her own mind? This Oswald alone theory was baloney. And this is a time when, remember, J. Edgar Hoover was shouting, Oswald alone, Oswald alone. One of the greatest distortions of history that we could possibly have. And Dorothy didn't buy it. 7 days after JFK was killed, she wrote the column, "The Oswald file must not close." I'll quote just a couple things from it. "The case is closed, is it? Well, I'd like to know how, in a big smart town like Dallas, a man like Jack Ruby, owner of a strip-tease honky-tonk, can stroll in and out of police headquarters as if it was a health club at a time when a small army of enforcers is keeping a tight security guard on Oswald. Security? What a word for it. I'm not going to try to speak for the people of Dallas, but around here, the people I talk to really believe that a man has a right to be tried in court. When that right is taken away by any man, by the incredible combination of Jack Ruby and insufficient security, we feel chilled." And then one of her most famous quotes, and this is really what got me going. "Justice is a big rug. When you pull it out from under one man, a lot of others fall too." Dorothy Kilgallen was on the job. She was going to find out what happened if it was the last day of her life, and as you will read, she did that till the last day of her life. The columns kept coming. The next one was still live topic, and talking about everybody not buying this Oswald alone theory, that there was something screwy about all this. Next was DA to link Ruby to Oswald, stating that she felt like strongly that the DA was going to connect these two. Nobody was reporting on this except Dorothy Kilgallen. Mark Lane, the acclaimed journalist, and author, said she was the only serious journalist looking into the JFK assassination. And why again? Because it was personal. Ruby has said repeatedly that he didn't know the alleged assassin of President Kennedy. But then Ruby's plea is temporary insanity. And listen to this. And there are a great many things he doesn't remember and isn't about to. She didn't buy all that, did she? So she went to the Ruby trial. Now, this is what's interesting. All these books. O'Reilly, Killing Kennedy. Reclaiming History, Vincent Bugliosi. Legacy of History. Case Closed by Gerald Posner. You think Dorothy Kilgallen's in any of those books? Only one. And they distort history completely by saying she was never even at the Ruby trial. They all missed it. They all missed Dorothy Kilgallen. Why? Because she was dead. And I'll explain to you what happened there. And you know what? I missed it. I should have gotten into this case when I heard that quote during the Melvin Belli book, but I just didn't get it. I just thought, wait a minute, what's my line as this woman? All of that. So we all missed it. And I'll tell you right now, my hope is it won't be missed, through history now. That what she found, her research, will be part of the equation. So she went to the Jack Ruby trial, and I want to show you the proof that she was there. Here's something that was written right then. Dorothy Kilgallen arrived in court yesterday and stopped the show. Remember, she's the celebrity, okay? Just like all those reporters were surrounding her at the Kilgallen case, or at the Dr. Sam Shepard trial. Joe B. Brown, one of her fans, gallantly insisted on an interview in his chambers. Melvin Belli of San Francisco and Joe Tannehill of Jasper, Texas, the co-counsel who we'll talk about in a little bit, took her to lunch at a nearby seafood restaurant called Vincent's, whose oysters, Belli declared, are the best this side of the native city's Fisherman's Wharf. She was there. Here's a photograph. There she is with Belli and Tannehill. You know, I'm not the greatest researcher in the world. All these guys could have found this out. They just didn't give a damn. You know why? Because Dorothy Kilgallen's research and what she found didn't fit with the conclusions that they wanted to draw. A lot of these authors, the conclusion, then you fit the facts to that, right? Instead of the other way around as it should be. Dorothy Kilgallen never did that, and I don't either. Okay, let's see some video. Dorothy Kilgallen at a Belli Tannehill news conference.
Prospectively, here in Dallas and away from Dallas, when we are moved, we may have to take some who have seen it on TV, not because they're qualified, but because eventually we want to get to trial. But we're not going to go to trial here unless we're forced to trial with witnesses who saw this on TV.
How long does a person have to live in Dallas County to be a prospective juror?
What are the residents
A
required
year in
the
the
community?
state and 6 months in the county, Ms. Kilgallen.
Is there any chance that you might get a transplanted Chicagoan or New Yorker or someone from another state?
Just had one.
Just had one who sat in the jury up in New
The
York.
one we challenged for cause to keep from being disbarred.
Well, you hear her voice right there. And there's also a videotape that actually shows her at that particular conference. Here's another snapshot. Here's Belli. There's Dorothy. There's Joe Tannehill. Would you say she's close to the defense team for Ruby? She's whispering in his ear. She was there. None of these authors were there. I wasn't there. Dorothy Kilgallen was there. Primary source. Okay. Now, with this research in mind, then I continued on. And I located an article in Midwest Magazine, of all places, published in Iowa, focuses on celebrities born in the Midwest. Many of you may not know this. Dorothy Kilgallen was born in Chicago before they moved to the East Coast. So I found that article. The name of it was Who Killed Dorothy Kilgallen? And I read it. And I saw in there that this publisher, this writer, had quoted some of Dorothy's best friends, her two hairdressers, a woman who was pretty much the last person to see her alive, we'll talk about, and Joe Tonnahill, that guy right there. I thought, oh my gosh, that's terrific. Somebody really did something with this. There wasn't any book written, but an article was written. So I called this guy, Larry Jordan, and I said, this is just great. I said, you know, I'm hopeful that you got these people. Hopefully I might talk to them. He said, Mark, they're all dead. I thought, oh boy, this is a dead end. He said, well, I got some good news for you. And I get a chill when I say this because I know this was meant to be, and I feel like maybe Dorothy just brought this to me. He said, there was a woman in L.A. who was obsessed with Kilgallen's death, and they videotaped the interviews. All of them. On the DorothyKilgallenStory.org, they're up there now. I promise people in the book, when they come to these quotes, they can go look at what these people said. It's not just my quoting them, and you're going to see some of them speak in a minute. That was the breakthrough for me. Because those people, what? They were right there. Primary witnesses. So, let's take a look at just two or three or four of those. First, let's look at another assurance that Dorothy Kilgallen was at the Ruby trial. Now, I have to think about this. This was the biggest thing in the world then, okay? Ruby had killed what? What everybody thought was the most hated man in the world, and now he's on trial, and Bell Eye's using this insanity defense that made no sense whatsoever, won't let Ruby testify, all right? Compromised his defense, his constitutional right to a fair trial, in my opinion, but she was there. Let's hear this. Yeah, right there. Mm-hmm. This is Ruby's impression of Kilgallen.
I think Jack was highly impressed with Dorothy Kilgallen, and he figured she was a very classy person. She had good programs on What's My Line, and she was a highly intelligent person. And I think that of all the writers that were down there during the Ruby trial, about 400 from all over the world, she probably was the one that to him was the most significant. Because he was in the entertainment business. He had a strip joint, and he looked upon her as someone that may be able to help him. He was trying to get help from everybody he could that had any significant standing in the community or anywhere else. He was a name dropper, you know.
That's Jack Ruby. Do you realize none of these have ever been seen? None of them. First time out. All right?
That was Jack Ruby doing the talking?
No, he's talking about Jack Ruby. I'm sorry.
Right.
He's talking about Jack Ruby. That's Tonnahill talking about Jack Ruby. Okay, let's look at the interview now taking place, how the interview took place, according to Tonnahill.
She told me that she had had a contact with a friend of Jack's from San Francisco. I believe it was an opera singer that he was very fond of, and she wanted to pass along a message to him. And I told Jack that, and he said, yeah, I'd like to talk with her. And I told the four guards, Jack had a bodyguard shield around him of 4 deputy sheriffs sitting there behind him, you know, and everywhere he went. And I told them that she wanted to ask Jack some questions and speak with him at recess, and that he had agreed to it, and they said, okay. So when the judge declared the noon recess, Jack went over and spoke with her.
I see. Where did they talk? Was it in the hallway?
No, it was in the courtroom right behind his chair where he was sitting. There was a rail there, and he got up and went to she was on the other side of the rail, Jack was on this side, and they had a little conversation. I think the press had already left the courtroom at that time.
I see. Approximately how long did they talk in private?
About 5 minutes.
I see. In the book by Lee Israel, it says 8 minutes, but some
Yeah, I say about, more or less.
approximately. Okay. And did you hear anything they said that was important?
She started out, she started out mentioning the fact that this opera singer in San Francisco had spoken with her about Jack, and she wanted to tell him, so I didn't pay much attention to what they were saying.
Do you know the name of the opera singer?
No,
Or so we don't know if the opera singer is still alive?
no.
I see. And did this opera singer ever turn up at another time in the trial?
No, but Jack was very enthusiastic about her, so they must have been pretty close friends.
So there's Tannehill. Again, the credibility of Dorothy being right in the middle of that action, okay? Then she wrote about it, and I just want to quickly read what she wrote about that interview, but also listen, because Dorothy Kilgallen was such a gifted wordsmith. If I could write like her, I'd have 25 bestsellers. Just listen to this. Jack Ruby's eyes were as shiny brown and white bright as the glass eyes of a doll. He tried to smile, but his smile was a failure. When we shook hands, his hand trembled in mine ever so slightly, like the heartbeat of a bird. I'm nervous and worried, he told me. I'm on the verge of something I don't understand, the breaking point maybe. She said when she asked Ruby, when she told Ruby, I think you're holding up pretty well, he said, I'm fooling you, Dorothy, I'm really scared. And she wrote, I went out into the almost empty lunchroom corridor, wondering what I really believed about this man. She was there, she reported it, everybody missed it. And then she had the biggest exclusive, maybe in the history of journalism. She exposed Jack Ruby's testimony before the Warren Commission, before it was supposed to be released. You can imagine how J. Edgar Hoover felt about that. Enemy, enemy, enemy. Okay? Big scoop, like the Nixon tapes, perhaps, or Snowden with his government secrets, whatever it may be. Biggest thing in the world, as you can imagine. And then she kept writing her columns. Maybe You Don't Know was one of them. She was never interviewed, by the way, by the Warren Commission, passed over. So now we know what her investigation was all about, and what did she tell the people closest to her about what she was doing. And these are quick clips. Mark Sinclair was her #1 hairdresser and best friend for a number of years. Charles Simpson was her second hairdresser and a very close friend. And those two provide really chilling accounts of what was going on with Kilgallen at the time. Sinclair comes up first. He's aware of her investigation.
She wouldn't stop on it. Pre-Warren exclusive, yeah. So she had it all. And she told me all about this, and she told, Donnell was there too, so I mean, he knew. We knew what she was doing.
At this time,
She said that this would be the case of a lifetime, a story of a lifetime, that she would prove that the president was assassinated. Who assassinated the president?
We're trying to trace her life as she gets towards November 8th, 1965, when she dies at the age of 52. Trips to New Orleans are important here. We don't know exactly what Jack Ruby told her, but we do know that she made one trip and then was going to make another to New Orleans. Who was the mafia don in New Orleans? Carlos Marcello. Let's hear about one trip she made to New Orleans.
Did Dorothy say that when she traveled with you in the future, she wanted to stay in a separate hotel?
She said that when we were in New Orleans. She called me, and I went there to do her hair so she'd look better in the pictures that were being taken of her. And she called me and she said, you have your ticket. I want you to go back to New York, and I don't want you to ever tell anyone that you were here with me.
Okay, well, let's say more about this. This happened, I'd say, approximately a month or 6 weeks before she died. You were in New York, and you got a phone call from her, and she said she was in New Orleans, right?
No. She went down on one plane and I went down on the other at the same time. And I stayed in a different hotel than she did. And she told me we were going to have dinner that evening. And I'd done her hair and left the hotel and was fooling around town. And she called me and she said, I want you to leave immediately. I don't want you to tell anyone you were ever here with me. I don't want anyone to know that you were ever here with me. And don't ask me any more questions. And I got on the plane and flew back to New York.
Threats to her life.
Around this time, you used to get her ready for her What's My Line show, and you would sometimes play the game of What's My Line.
Yeah,
with her
I
to get
played
her
it all the
psyched
time,
up,
yes.
where you would pretend to be a contestant, like you make.
We would play the game. Donnell was there, and we would play the game around her.
While you were playing the game once, did she ever say something out of the blue about threats on her life?
Yes. She told me that this is a couple of weeks before she died, or maybe 3 or 4 weeks before she died. I'm not sure the time anymore. But she told me she was going to get a gun because her life was being threatened, and she was scared for her life and for her family.
She was going to get a gun, scared for her life, for herself and her family. She was also scared at the time that Carrie was going to be kidnapped. Charles Simpson, who he called Donnell earlier, which is a name for him as well, Charles Simpson on the JFK assassination.
Did you have the feeling that she was investigating the murder case of Jack Ruby killing Oswald and Oswald killing Kennedy? Was she digging into that?
She never quit. She never quit. She dug up something. She dug up something about the assassination of President Kennedy that somebody didn't want her to know, because she even told us of her own volition. She said, I used to share things with you guys, and she said, but after I have found out now what I know, she said, if the wrong people knew what I know, it would cost me my life. And she was dead about 9 months later.
Scary stuff, isn't it? Scary stuff. So we'll leave that, and now we'll go to November 8th, 1965. We know what she was doing. She'd been to New Orleans once. Now she was going again. And she told her makeup man about that second trip she was going to take. Right at this time also, Dorothy Kilgallen was writing a book for Random House about the JFK assassination. She had a thick file of her documents. Now remember, you couldn't make copies of them like that back then, so it was a single file, this thick. In the book it describes exactly what was in there, interviews, documents, all of her investigation. She was writing that book, and it was known that she was writing that book and that she was going to expose who was involved with the JFK assassination. That's why, she had to be scared that people would, be threatened by what she was going to expose. So she told her makeup man about the trip to New Orleans. He asked her, is it Kennedy? She replied, yes, and very cloak and daggerish. I'm going to meet a source whom I do not know but will recognize, who is going to give me information about the case. To her lawyer, she said, I'm going to break the real story and have the biggest scoop of the century. They couldn't let her go to New Orleans, could they? They weren't going to do that. And so, on November 8th, 1965, Dorothy Kilgallen is found dead in her townhouse on East 68th Street in New York City. The authorities are not called till late afternoon. Two detectives show up. They find a couple Seconal bottles on a nightstand by the bed. The medical examiner shows up, and he's from the Brooklyn branch of the ME's office, not the Manhattan branch, which is very unusual and fits into the whole pattern of how this death was covered up. The autopsy report is, no, we're not, we'll just go on to the autopsy report. We'll go to Mark Sinclair in a minute. Okay, autopsy report is prepared, and we'll go back to that in a second. What we want to look at when we look at the autopsy report, the cover of it, is what this medical examiner decided. And that will conflict with what you're going to hear right now from Mark Sinclair. He's going to tell you what happened when he got to the townhouse on November 8th, 1965.
Did she tell you what her plans were for later that night after What's My Line?
She was going home afterwards.
Well,
But obviously she didn't, because she went to the Regency.
Do you suspect that she got a phone call after you left?
After I left, I think she got a phone call from somebody. and she agreed to meet whoever it was at the Regency. That's my belief. Because she wasn't going to Clark's. She had asked me if I wanted to meet her because she did not have anybody she was going to meet with. And she was not dressing for a date.
Well, she did end up going to Clark's briefly with Bob Bach.
Well,
she
maybe,
told
but
him.
not long. But she might have done that and then gone home, but there wouldn't have been an evening like she had.
Why didn't you accept her offer to go with her somewhere?
I was tired myself. She had done something every day that week, and she had more appointments for me the following week. And I didn't want to see anymore. I wanted to go home.
Did she tell you that she had a meeting at her son's school the next
Yes,
morning?
on that was Sunday. I did her hair before the show, and she told me to come the next morning before 9. I arrived at the house at 9, used my key. I think it was about 8:30, 8:45. Used my key, let myself in, went upstairs, and Dorothy was dead in her bedroom.
You went to the third floor bedroom that she did not sleep in that room.
She did not sleep in that room. And when I entered, Dorothy was not in that room, but the air conditioning was on. It was cold out. That's the room.
What about that air conditioning vent? Was that?
No, that's the dressing room. Oh, no. That's a heater. That's not an air conditioner. This is the air conditioner.
Oh, that's it, where it would have been in that position.
Right in that same position. And it was blowing out in that room. And I was here. And the light was on, and she wasn't there. So I turned on my curling irons, and I walked into the bedroom, not thinking that she would be there. And she was sitting up in bed, and I walked over to the bed and touched her, and I knew she was dead right away.
And how was the bed made up?
The bed was spotless. She was dressed very peculiarly. She was dressed like I've never seen her before. She always dressed in pajamas and old socks, and her makeup was off, and her hair was off, and everything was done. She was completely dressed like she was going out. The hair was in place, the makeup was on, the false eyelashes were on, the matching peignoir and robe, book laid out on the bed, a drink on the table, the light was on, the air conditioning was on. Though you didn't need an air conditioner, you would have had the heat on. And she was always cold. And why she had the air conditioning on, oh, I don't know.
Possibly someone else had turned it on.
Well, maybe to keep the body at a certain temperature, you know.
Was the glass on the bedside table within her reach?
It was on the right-hand side. No, it was way away, way over. And the book, it was turned upside down. It wasn't in the right position for if you'd been reading, laid it down. And it was laid down so perfectly, you know, like that. And one hand, rigor mortis had set in on one hand, the right hand, and it had drawn up the covers a little bit. And there was lipstick on this sleeve of the bolero jacket. And the light was on, and she was sitting up.
So if you were a detective or a medical examiner, would you think that possibly there was something wrong with that death scene? No investigation. Autopsy report. It's in the book for the first time. We got it at the National Archives. These guys could have found that. It's not hard to find these things. They just didn't care. Dorothy Kilgallen was dead, erased from history. Nobody cared. Autopsy report you're going to read in the book. They said she died of an acute combination of alcohol, basically, and barbiturates, meaning seconal. All right? That was given out to the public. And then this guy adds, circumstances undetermined. Nobody in the family, no journalists, no police officers, nobody in the DA's office, nobody looked into this. It was like she was a druggie and alcoholic, and let's forget it and move on. Well, in this autopsy report, you don't have to be the greatest researcher in the world to see that where it says seconal, also below it, it says Tulinol. Well, again, here's a medical examiner who wants to close the case. He's from the Brooklyn Medical Examiner's Office, which an eyewitness will tell you in the book was mafia-controlled at that time. And they want to just close the case because it doesn't fit with what is an accidental death. It's not suicide, it's not accidental death, but that's what they want to show, so that's how they do it. All right? Autopsy report. Okay, now we have a cover-up right away, and I think you'll read in the book there was a cover-up here. But then there's another one. 3 years later, one of the toxicologists in the medical examiner's office, I know there's a real big word for it, that keeps bodily fluids because they believe technology will improve and they can analyze them better, kept her fluids. And he, Dr. Umberger, and a chemist named John Broach, they looked at that new evidence that they had, and they found 3 barbiturates, including phenobarbital, Tulinol, Seconal, phenobarbital. All right, accidental death. Come on. They concealed that evidence, and I'm tough on them on the book. I've interviewed the widow of John Broach, who, by the way, said Kilgallen was bumped off, and the son of that man, who talks about then how scared his dad was of those people running the Brooklyn ME's office. And that's why they didn't give out that evidence, because if they had produced that evidence, gotten it in the media, taken it to the DA, whatever, there would have been what? An investigation into Kilgallen's death. But it was covered up, it was buried for 50 years until now. I think so strongly about this particular case that I wrote a letter to the Manhattan, I guess they call him a New York County District Attorney, Cyrus Vance Jr. It was delivered on Monday. This is a letter, 3 or 4 pages. I listed 20-some reasons why Kilgallen's death should be investigated. I went ahead and sent copies of the videotapes to him, columns, articles, photos, everything I could think of, to try to get them reopen, well, really basically investigate her case, to look into the last days of her life, to talk to witnesses that are still alive, because they are. There's a handful, maybe 10 witnesses that are still alive that they should talk to. Who knows whether that will work out, but last Sunday, a reporter from the New York Post wrote an article about the book and Dorothy, and exposed my sending that letter to the DA. 235,000 people viewed that article last Sunday. Dorothy's voice is going to be heard one way or another here. I guarantee you that, if it's the last thing I ever do. The DA told that reporter yesterday they're reviewing my letter and the evidence. And she submitted, the reporter yesterday, questions about what they're going to do at this particular point. Why am I doing this? Why does it matter at all, 50 years after Dorothy Kilgallen died, that we even look into this? Because my belief is murder. I don't care if it happened 5 days ago, 5 years ago, or 50 years ago. Murder is murder. And especially since there's a suspect out there, a main suspect who is still alive. He's named in the book. I interviewed him 3 or 4 times. He's been interviewed by others. You're going to make up your own mind. This is kind of a true crime murder mystery with all the suspects in there, but he's certainly one. And I believe he is the mystery man that Kilgallen met at the Regency Hotel a few hours before she died. His statements are inconsistent. He knew Kilgallen really well. She suspected him of leaking her JFK assassination investigation information. And he wrote 2 poems. I'm going to read them to you, and then we'll put the other one up. 2 poems that I believe are strong incrimination of him being involved in Dorothy Kilgallen's death. The first is called Never Trust a Stiff at a Typewriter. There's a way to quench a gossip's stench that never fails. One cannot write if zippered tight. Somebody who's dead could tell no tales. And then this one. Try this one. Bartender mixing the drugs? Well, you're going to see my theories in the book as to how I believe Dorothy Kilgallen was killed and why, and what happened those last few hours of her death. But we talked about 3 barbiturates, didn't we? How did they get into Kilgallen's system? Poem reads, while I'm spilling my guts, leaking JFK assassination information, She's driving me nuts. Please fetch us 2 drinks on the run. Just skip all the noise and make one of them poison. And don't even tell me which one. This guy needs to be investigated. He lives in Ohio. I've told him about the book. I sent him a book. I want him to know. People wonder whether he'll sue me or something. I hope he does. I'd love to see him in a courtroom, under oath. If he didn't, if he wasn't involved directly with Kilgallen's death, he knows who was. And I hope that is the kind of evidence that will persuade the DA to reopen this case. So, my quest is to speak for Dorothy, to give her the justice she was denied in 1965, because her whole life she fought for justice for everybody else. And then there was no investigation, and everybody thought, you know, she was a druggie and an alcoholic. Well, she wasn't. And you'll see evidence in the book of what she was like the few days before she died. There was no evidence of that. But sometimes what do? We believe the worst in people. And that's what happened here. Her remarkable career erased from history. Her JFK assassination research erased from history. Martin Luther King wrote, Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And I believe the justice that was denied to Dorothy Kilgallen, we need to right a wrong here. And I'm hopeful that my book and Dorothy's voice will cause an investigation by the New York District Attorney. Hopefully there are people out there who may know about this. I hope that this gentleman in Ohio may have told somebody, bragged to him about him being involved. But one way or another, the truth must come out. Thank you.
Time now for everybody's favorite guessing game, What's My Line? First, the popular columnist whose voice of Broadway appears in papers from coast to coast, Miss Dorothy Kilgallen.
Besides being a TV star on CBS's Emmy Award-winning game show, What's My Line?, Dorothy Kilgallen was a Pulitzer Prize-nominated newspaper columnist read by millions and a crack investigative reporter who covered high-profile criminal trials. No wonder the New York Post called her the most powerful female voice in America. Ernest Hemingway said she was one of the greatest women writers in the world, and famed attorney F. Lee Bailey stated, Dorothy was a very good reporter of criminal cases, the best there was. At 52, Kilgallen, who broke the glass ceiling, balancing her careers with motherhood, had it all: fame, fortune, and family. She was the first female media icon whose accomplishments rival Oprah's and Barbara Walters.
Dorothy, if you had to be confined to one job of the many that you do, which would it be?
I think that I would have to settle for my first love and my true love, the newspaper business. It still has me and always will, I think, I hope.
In late 1963, Kilgallen began investigating the biggest case of her career, the JFK assassination.
She said that this would be the case of a lifetime, that she would prove who assassinated the president.
She dug up something about the assassination of President Kennedy that somebody didn't want her to know. She said if the wrong people knew what I know, it would cost me my life.
On November 8, 1965, Kilgallen was found dead in her Manhattan townhouse bedroom.
So I turned on my curling irons, and I walked over to the bed and touched her, and I knew she was dead right away.
According to the New York City Medical Examiner's Office, the official cause was accidental death due to acute ethanol and barbiturate intoxication, circumstances undetermined. But was Kilgallen's death an accident? No investigation followed. Some believe she committed suicide. Others thought the feisty journalist may have been murdered. Suspects include her arch-enemy Frank Sinatra, J. Edgar Hoover, a dangerous mafia don, and a mystery man she met hours before she died. Her hairdresser, Mark Sinclair, believed the death scene had been staged.
She always dressed in pajamas and old socks, and her makeup was off and her hair was off and everything was done. She was completely dressed like she was going out. The hair was in place, the makeup was on, the false eyelashes were on.
No doubt exists that Dorothy Kilgallen was scared during the final days of her life.
She told me a couple of weeks before she died she was going to get a gun because her life was being threatened, and she was scared for her life and for her family.
Did the woman who battled for equality in a man's world really die of a drug overdose, or was she poisoned with a homicide covered up by a corrupt medical examiner's office? Most important, did Dorothy Kilgallen receive the justice she deserved? Newly discovered smoking gun evidence renders a shocking verdict in former USA Today and CNN legal analyst Mark Shaw's whodunit murder mystery, The Reporter Who Knew Too Much. Available December 2016 from Post Hill Press, wherever books are sold. Distributed by Simon&Schuster.
Justice for Dorothy.